Please welcome co-owner and co-president Valerie Wilson Travel, Jennifer Wilson-Buttigieg, and CEO of Lindblad Expeditions, Sven-Olof Lindblad, for a discussion moderated by Skift Global Tourism reporter Rosie Spinks.
Thank you both for joining me today. Really looking forward to this discussion. So one of the biggest challenges in this industry, really, that we talk about all the time and across all of our beats at Skift is how fragmented it is. It's lots of different industries that fall under travel and tourism. I'm curious how both of you have seen that play out in the pandemic. Have you seen that as a big weakness in the response?
Jennifer, do you want to go first?
Be happy to, Sven. Rosie, privileged to be here today on behalf of travel management companies to hopefully set the stage. Fragmentation and so much information has been really confusing, not only for the advisor, but it exacerbates the uncertainty for that customer today.
Sven, do you have any thoughts?
The travel industry has always been in many ways fragmented. And in a situation like what we're dealing with now, it would be kind of helpful in many ways if there was more coordination in terms of certain aspects of dealing with this particular pandemic. The cruise industry, for example, which I don't view ourselves necessarily as part of per se, but I think they've gone to great lengths to kind of coordinate their efforts and have found ways to collaborate, even though they're very competitive with each other. So, this is a time when you can, obviously, if you can find ways to sort of coalesce around a shared problem, that would be useful. And perhaps one of the learnings that will come out of this is that maybe what we do is need some kind of a forum that can deal with that, where competition goes by the wayside and you focus on your collective problem.
I wonder.
Can I jump in 1 second, Rosie, because I agree with you completely, and I'll give you a quick example. Our headquarters is in New York City, and I live about 20 miles north of Manhattan. And just in the last week, New Yorkers can now come back from 6 states without quarantine. So it literally is changing daily. And I agree completely with Sven that if I had this magic wish list, I would love to see airlines and hotels and cruise lines and tour operators, all the trade associations, any brands that have been part of Skift today, to come together with a more unified platform. So there's one place to go for information and updated information.
And do you think that needs to be sort of a new thing that's created, or are there existing structures in which we could have that? We have WTTC, we have UNWTO. We've had guidelines from both of those organizations and every other trade org in the industry. How do you feel about the sort of glut of guidelines that we've seen?
Honestly, I think I'd take a line from Sebastian earlier and say we need to be daring and audacious. And the CDC, I'm an American citizen, has given misinformation, unfortunately. I think there personally has been a lack of leadership. I would think it might be an opportunity right now to relook at WHO or CDC. WTTC certainly has given some great guidelines, but this is the largest pandemic in 102 years. We've never had a society that's more globally in touch with all parts of the world. I think there's a need and a demand for a coordinated effort. So yes, I would say it's a great opportunity for that. Sven?
Yeah, well, when you think about it, living in the United States, it's pretty frightening that there are so many different answers to the same questions coming out of different states, different government entities, different organizations, and the public. They're not doctors. So it gets to the point where it's very difficult for them to filter and to know what to believe in. And then you add on top of it this, extraordinary idea in the United States that we've politicized this whole situation. So we've got a complete, utter mess, right? And there's very, very little trust in terms of the government from citizenry as it relates to the. I would give us a real failing grade as a country in terms of how we handle this, and in terms of institutions like WTTC and WHO, the World Health Organization, which we've also diminished its influence in certain ways politically. It's just a big mess as far as I'm concerned, and very, very hard for individual citizens to figure out what's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and Jennifer, something you said in one of our calls last week, which struck me, is that people in the travel advisor role, who are becoming more and more important, sort of as the day, it seems, are now in this role of aggregators of information, for their clients who are just totally overwhelmed. Can you say a little more about that?
Absolutely. It's one of my new catchphrases, because advisors used to be agents, and then we sort of grew up in this industry and we became advisors, and we also became advocates. So we got people back where they needed to be when this crisis first began. No differently, when we would tell you if a property had a new general manager, or new construction, or new amenities, or what your visa or passport requirements were, we now are aggregating information from IATA, from World Odometer, from Johns Hopkins, from CDC, and they all, to Sven's point, have conflicting information. So those travelers are relying on us right now, and we can't say what's safe, because everyone always has a different tolerance for risk, and did long before the pandemic, and will years when the pandemic is gone. But we've become the consumer's trusted source. So what they're looking for us is information, facts, as of today, in real time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this perception of safety. We've heard, yesterday we heard from Lori Garrett in our kickoff event, which was really fascinating. She was talking about, the merits of surface hygiene versus ventilation and aerosol. When you look at what the travel industry has done to win back confidence, to try and get people out there, do you think there has been an element of, let's just throw everything at the wall and hope that it's enough, or and people feel that it's safe? Or do you think that there's been a real conscious, where have you seen a really conscious effort to be like, this is what's important?
I would actually say it's all part of this iterative process. As many of the leaders over the last day and a half have spoken about, it sort of was panic. Oh crap, we really are in a pandemic. What do I do with my business? Survive. Now, how do we look towards the future? And not just the future of 12 months, 36 months, or several years. So I look at the safety and clean and health protocols very similarly. We now don't know, there's no brand, hotel, airline, et cetera, that's not partnered with like the Mayo Clinic or Lysol. That's not what we used to think about in hospitality. It used to be thread count and spas and things like that. So I think that's just one step in an iterative process to allow the customer to feel that something is in their control. They can choose to travel. Travel is very doable right now. It's just different. So I would say, again, this is going to change over time. People want that human connection. They don't necessarily want to stand behind a plexiglass. They don't necessarily want their towels in saran wrap. These are all interim steps as we start to learn more. But Lori was a great speaker yesterday, and I think the message is loud and clear. The new Harvard Business School study came out, wear masks. This is not a political conversation. This is a health crisis right now. How do we solve the problem at hand?
Sven, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there's two things you've got to accomplish, I believe, simultaneously. You've got to give people a sense of confidence that you have developed a system or a set of protocols that will keep them safe. Obviously, that's at the forefront. And at the same time, you have to convince people that their experience is not going to be diminished while they pursue being safe, right? So, because at the end of the day, this is not something going on a holiday is not something they have to do. It's something they want to do, and it needs to maintain its joy and its wonder. And a lot of these protocols, if you're not careful, can diminish that. So those things need to be combined. But they do care deeply. We know for a fact that our audience cares deeply about safety and protocols. And we've got a team of 3 senior people in the organization who meet every day to look at the latest technologies, the latest applications of testing and various things, including we have a consulting physician that's on. And this is a dynamic process, and the charge that they have is we have to come up with a system where we believe it's safe, where we can credibly relate that to our guests, that's practical, and it does not diminish the experience. And it's not easy to do that, but I think we're very, very close to getting there. We haven't started operating anything yet. We have 9 ships laid up all over the world, and hopefully we'll get them out there soon. But a credible medical solution combined with not diminishing the experience is a key to the whole thing, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Lindblad has sort of taken this really almost like the Cadillac approach of getting people on those ships. There was a really interesting Bloomberg article about it. I know this session isn't about cruise, but I think cruise is sort of an interesting thing to apply this to because of the unique challenges on those ships. I mean, your plan is to test passengers twice, once before they leave where they live, and once when they arrive at the point of origin for the itineraries. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And then also testing while aboard ship, so that any sort of hint of anything, you can test people instantly aboard the ships. But we do believe that this double test is important because everything can fall apart if somebody comes aboard and winds up having COVID. So you have 5 days in advance of leaving home, within 5 days of leaving home. So there is a window there. Somebody's getting on a plane, somebody whatever, and then there's all kinds of different opinions about incubation periods. So you have to be prepared to test at any point where it's warranted. And if you don't have that ability, in my estimation, you don't have a safe situation.
Right. So, the travel and tourism industry has to win back traveler confidence at every point of the supply chain, from when they leave the house to the airport to the airline onwards. Is there any of the sub industries that comprise the travel industry that you think has done quite well in terms of what they've offered and inviting travelers back?
I haven't looked honestly, I haven't looked in detail about what specific other what specific plans other companies have. I have seen that more people are realizing in the last weeks that testing is a key component, where that wasn't necessarily on the table as an aspect of their solutions. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good thing because we all are vulnerable to the weakest link in the chain here. If a cruise ship goes out and all of a sudden there's a bunch of people that get COVID and everything's stopped again and the public loses confidence, it's a highly irresponsible act to go out without really good protocols, because you're not only hurting yourself and you're not only putting your guests at risk, you're potentially destroying an entire industry. So, or a segment of the industry. So I think, and from my point of view, anything any one of us discovers should be willingly and openly shared with anybody else who's interested, right? Because this should not be, none of this should be proprietary. So we've made it very, very clear. If anybody calls us up and says, "What are you doing? Are there any ideas that you have that we might benefit from?" We will give it to them 100% instantly.
There's been a much greater sense of sharing of information, as Sven said, even among what were once perceived competitors, with cruise lines, with hotels, with airlines, with travel management firms. We all want to elevate and make change because we recognize 1 in 10 jobs are tied to global tourism. We recognize that this sector was so badly devastated in the last few months, and we want to collectively elevate. Right.
Someone in the audience asked about sort of this honor system that we've entered into, wherein you can say, I have, the WTTC Safe Travel Stamp, or I'm following AHLA's, I forget what theirs is called, but their guidelines. But there's not a lot of enforcement. That almost seems like a brand opportunity. If you trust the brand, you've stayed with them a bunch of times, maybe you feel like, I think they would do a good job. Any thoughts on that? Their actual question was, what role does the honor system have in the perception of risk?
Honestly, in a pandemic, I think an honor system, it sounds almost hokey, like going back in time. I went to a college, very small Quaker school that had an honor code. So it's instilled in my core values. but we're only as good as our weakest link, to Sven's point. So I would say there are a few things. Customers are going to trust brands that they have known before. Customers are going to trust brands that are able to change right now, and are going to gravitate towards something that they connect with. And Rosie, as you and I spoke before, in the middle of this pandemic, one of the initiatives, VWT partnered with GeoSure. It's an app. Every customer is living with their electronic device now, and it's a mobile app that through AI can start to aggregate information. And it used to be more about safety. Would I feel comfortable in a certain country or a city or part of town? Now it has health criteria. So I think this is part of the progression. We as an industry, as an ecosystem, have to look at some basics. We need to test. We need to wear masks. We need to be responsible for each other as part of this ecosystem. It's not one answer. It's multifaceted.
I just would like to add that, Jennifer and her particular segment of the industry, the travel advisors community, I mean, they prior to the pandemic, they had a difficult enough time filtering so much information and so many different products and dealing with and now layering this on top and having this sort of the individual travel advisors having to filter what they believe are credible answers to a pandemic in terms of somebody's activities. That's asking a lot of them, right? They're not trained to do that per se.
Right.
And so, they're doing an extraordinary job sort of navigating this incredibly complex environment. So Jennifer, to you and the advisory community as a whole, thank you so much for the efforts you're making.
Well, thank you. I was on your website earlier today, and you recognize the value of the travel advisor as part of your Salesforce and channel. And I typed in a couple zip codes and saw several of my associates come up, and even my sister on one of them. So you do understand the role that we have as an advocate, as an advisor, no different than a lawyer or a financial planner. Investing that customer's investment.
I will say I'm a true millennial in that all the travel I've ever booked, I've booked through, online platforms. But if I were to plan a big trip in the near future, or the medium future, I would definitely consider using an advisor now because of exactly what you're talking about. So I promised Sven that we would not spend this whole session talking about testing and vaccines and masks, et cetera. So let's talk a little bit about, we have this fragmented industry. What is the industry that we want to see on the other side of this crisis? And what opportunities are there, beyond health protocols to approach this in a different way? And beyond just traveler confidence, just getting more people to take more interesting trips with more operators, et cetera.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just start with that. So the travel industry has a huge opportunity. Well, it always has. And it's after this pandemic, obviously travel is going to change quite dramatically in a multitude of ways. One of the ways it's going to change is that the resources a lot of countries and communities can devote to maintaining the health of the assets that the tourism industry needs in order to attract travelers, like national parks, for example, historic sites, cultural investments. All of that will be diminished because the resources won't be there because they're coming out of a pandemic and they're going to have to probably develop other priorities as a consequence of that. So the landscape is going to change in that regard. I'll give you a particular example. So you take an area like the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands is protected by the National Park System. The National Park System is financed by the government of Ecuador that is being hugely challenged right now. Low oil prices and a pandemic simultaneously is absolutely devastating the economy of that country. So all of a sudden now, that whole system will be diminished in terms of the labor pool and the investment that the country makes in it. That could be catastrophic because all of a sudden the Taiwanese and Chinese fishermen can come into the marine protected area because they can't afford to buy fuel for the patrol boats. And I'm just using that as an example. And that type of scenario exists all over the world. So we as an industry, and I just ought to be much more proactive in finding creative ways to invest in the assets that we trade upon. So national parks are an asset, for example, and the traveler is delighted to be engaged in helping to restore these places, helping to protect these places, if creatively approached. So tourists and the tourism industry have an opportunity to be a major, major force for good if harnessed correctly. And so that to me is a huge opportunity. In many ways, we're going to have to step it up, or else there's going to be an acceleration in places being degraded. But aside from that, going forward into the future, there are so many challenges with the natural world, for example, that we, as tourists, as a consequence of having had experiences in these places, developing some kind of reverence for places, it's a real opportunity to really participate in meaningful change. And sometimes a crisis becomes catalytic to these kinds of thoughts. And we ought to come out of this with something positive. We've been hurt. It's been painful. It's hit everybody really, really hard. We ought to come out of it at the other end with some positive ideas that are really meaningful for the future.
Sure. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on any sort of positive change in terms of a more cohesive industry?
I think there'll probably be 2 or 3, quite honestly. I think it'll be a blend of online and high touch. It's not one extreme or the other. I think your comment as a do-it-yourselfer, many people often thought of my business as international and for the extraordinary vacation safari cruise. Running into a client in the grocery store at a social distance this weekend. He wants to celebrate an anniversary and he wants to come back to us for that vetted knowledge and for amenities and for the special perks. So I think right now we're focused on health and safety and protocols, but all the things that drove customers to all of these companies and brands over the last few decades is going to come back because people definitely want life experiences. They believe that I believe it's going to be far less transactional and far more consultative. And life's precious. We have one shot going through this. And one thing we've learned throughout this time is family is important and health is important. And not being able to celebrate some of birthday, milestone, anniversary, graduation. We're looking through life with a different lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And that feels like a good note to end this on. So I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for the questions as well.